Welcome to this podcast, brethren. And today I'm sharing a few reflections on Easter. Now, Easter celebrations were just celebrated the other week, but I still find it worthy to have a few reflections on what Easter is, why it happened, when it happened, and what that means to the Christian faith. Now, Mark chapter 14 is dedicated to describing how things turned out even to the night of the Lord's Supper. Now, as Mark chapter 14 starts, it tells us when this was, and it says, Now the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread were only 2 days away. And the Bible says that the chief priests and the teachers of the law were looking for some sly way to arrest Jesus and kill him, but not during this feast, they said, or the people may riot. So, in themselves, they had planned to execute Jesus, but not on this feast, not during this feast. Otherwise, they thought people may riot, right? Now, verse 3 tells us that Jesus was in Bethany sharing a meal in the house of someone called Simon the leper. And here, a woman comes with expensive oil and breaks the jar and anoints the body of Jesus. Now, she received some rebukes from the disciples, some of the disciples of Jesus, and they had this idea, we can as well sell this oil and help out the poor. But Jesus was saying, you'll always have the poor to help them, but you won't have always me around, right? And he tells them what this woman has done is worthy because she has anointed my body and prepared it for burial, right? She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare me for my burial. That is Mark chapter 14 verse 8. Now I tell you the truth, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will always be told in memory of her, right? Like the way I'm telling you guys. Now in verse 10, we see Judas reaching out to the chief priests to seek for an opportunity, right? To betray Jesus. Now, these people were delighted. In verse 11, they were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money. So he watched for an opportunity to hand him over, right? We see Judas in himself willfully advancing to seek for an opportunity to hand over Jesus to the chief priests. Now, in verse 12, we have another specific description. On the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, when it was customary to sacrifice the Passover lamb. Now, why is this description important? In its specificity, it tells us when this Last Supper happened. Now, it happened on the day that it was customary to sacrifice the lamb that was to be celebrated for the Passover, right? Now, Jesus instructs some of his disciples to go and prepare a place that they would celebrate this Passover feast when the hour comes. Now, starting from verses 20, it is one of the 12. Now, Jesus here predicts that one of his disciples will hand him over, one who dips bread into the bowl with me. Again, the prediction of Jesus is very specific to the person that will hand him over. Now, verse 22 says, While they were eating, Jesus took bread, gave thanks, and broke it, and gave it to his disciples, saying, Take, this is my body. Then he took the cup, gave thanks, and offered it to them, and they all drank from it. Verse 24, This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. Now, here Jesus institutes a new covenant, right? He says to them, Now, this bread is my body, take, eat it. This drink is my blood of the covenant. And there's a slight description of this covenant, which is poured out for many, right? The blood of Christ was to be poured out for many, right? A few hours later, we would see them going to the Garden of Gethsemane, the arrest, Jesus appearing before the rulers of that time, and everything unfolded in a manner that ended up in the cross. Now, this is a covenant that is instituted on this very night that the Passover was usually celebrated. Now, it's important to note this because it came to substitute the celebrations of sacrificing a lamb. And now I want us to consider Exodus chapter 12 that gives us a description of why the Passover happened. What was the Passover, right? Now, Exodus chapter 12 is dedicated to telling us what the Passover was, right? Now I'll consider a couple of verses in this whole chapter that kind of describes to us what led to the genesis of the Passover. Now, in Exodus chapter 14, starting from verse 2 and verse 6, the Bible says this month is to be for you the first month, of your year. Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month, each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. Now, on the 10th day, they were to single out the lamb, take care of it, and on the 14th day, according to verse 6, they were to slaughter it down, right? Now, some of this blood that came from this lamb was to be used to mark the sides and the top of the doorpost, right? They were to mark out their houses by marking the doorposts, the sides and the top doorposts of their houses with the blood that came from this lamb. That is according to verse 7. Now, there were some specific instructions on how to prepare this food and how to eat this food. Now, the instructions included the following in verse 8: roasting the meat on fire, right? And verse 8 says, that same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire along with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or cooked in water, but roast it over fire. Head, legs, and inner parts. Like, this was the specific instruction given to these people. Now, in verse 11, it says, this is how you are to eat it: with your cloak tucked into your belts, your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. So they were to eat it like people who were ready to go for a journey, right? So they were to eat in haste, right? They were to eat it quickly. Now, in verses 12 and verses 29, we have the description of how God passed judgment on the land of Egypt. Verse 12 says, on that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both men and animals, and I will bring judgment on the gods of Egypt, right? So during this Passover, God passed judgment on the land of Egypt, and men and animals were not spared. The firstborns of men and the firstborns of animals were equally killed, right? Now in verse 29 says, at midnight the Lord struck down all the firstborns in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on the throne to the firstborn of the prisoner who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. So God passed judgment on the land of Egypt on this very night. Now in verse 14, this is a day you are to commemorate for the generations to come. You shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance. So this was something that was to be celebrated even in the generations that were to come later on. Now in verse 24, the Bible says, obey these instructions as a lasting ordinance for you and your descendants. So this was something that was to be passed down to other generations. Equally in verse 27, then tell them, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, who passed over the houses of Israelites in Egypt and spared our homes when he struck down the Egyptians. So this was the reason that they were to give to their kids when they asked them, Father, why are we celebrating this? And the Bible is clear, is on this very night, God spared our homes while we were in Egypt, but passed down judgment on the Egyptians, right? Now, verse 42 says, because the Lord kept vigil that night to bring them out of Egypt, on this night all the Israelites are to keep vigil to honor the Lord for the generations to come. So it was a commemoration to celebrate what God did on this very night. And also verse 51, the Bible says, and on that very day the Lord brought the Israelites out of Egypt by their division. So that is what happened on this Passover night. Now in verse 16, the Bible says, on the first day hold a sacred assembly, and another one on the seventh day. Do not work at all on these days except to prepare food for everyone to eat. That is all you may do. This is a description of a Sabbath that happened during this feast of unleavened bread. Now, the specificity of this instruction is that on the first day and on the seventh day, they were to hold a holy assembly or a holy convocation, a holy meeting of the people of Israel. They were to celebrate and keep it a Sabbath. And this is important again. We will consider the actual day that Jesus got crucified. There is some mentions of some Sabbath and all that, and so it's important to consider whether it was the Sabbath of the seventh day or the Sabbath of this feast of unleavened bread. Now, verses 17 and 20, the Bible says, celebrate the feast of unleavened bread, because it was on this very day that I brought your divisions out of Egypt. Celebrate this day as a lasting ordinance for the generations to come. In the first month you are to eat bread without yeast, from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day. For 7 days no yeast is to be found in your house. And whoever eats anything with yeast in it must be cut off from the community of Israel, whether he is an alien or native born. Eat nothing made with yeast. Wherever you live, you must eat unleavened bread. So this is a command that happens on this first month of when they were to celebrate this. They were to, starting from the evening of the 14th day until the evening of the 21st day, they were to eat bread without yeast. And whoever broke this commandment and ate bread with yeast was to be cut off from these people, whether it's an alien or someone who's a native born, right? Now, verse 23 describes this Passover, how things turned out on this very night. When the Lord goes through the land to strike down the Egyptians, he will see the blood on the top and sides of the doorframe and will pass over that doorway, and he will not permit the destroyer to enter your houses and strike you down. So the blood that was marked on the sides and the top of the doorpost was to mark them out as a people of God, a people who are living in the covenant that God had given them. Now, starting from verses 43 to 49, the Bible says that, and the Lord said to Moses and Aaron, these are the regulations of the Passover. No foreigner is to eat it. No foreigner is to eat of it. Any slave you have bought may eat of it after you have circumcised him, but a temporary resident and a hired worker may not eat of it. It must be eaten inside one house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones. The whole community of Israel must celebrate it. An alien living among you who wants to celebrate the Lord's Passover must have all the males in the household circumcised. Then he must take part like one born in the land. No uncircumcised male may eat of it. The same law applies to the native born and to the alien living among you. Now, one thing that stands out here is only those people who were in the covenant of God were allowed to celebrate it. Now, this covenant was marked out by circumcision, as God had instituted his covenant with Abraham and instructed him to circumcise all the males in his house, including those whom he had as his workers, right? Now, those slaves that belonged to that house, as long as they were circumcised, they were allowed to partake of this Passover, and no uncircumcised male was allowed to partake of this Passover. So it was specific for the people who were in covenant with God. So it was for the people of God. Another thing that stands out here is verse 46. It must be taken inside one house. Take none of the meat outside the house. Do not break any of the bones. Now, we remember again in the descriptions in the gospel that Jesus was never broken. None of his bones were broken. And in fact, when a criminal was not dead by the time they were going to lower them from the cross, their bones were broken down to hasten their death. And when Jesus was on the cross, he died before the authorities went to lower down those criminals from the cross, and so his bones were spared and were not broken, even a single of them. And so he meets the criteria that qualified these lambs that were considered for the Passover feast of the Lord. Right. This is now what happened, and this is what now is being celebrated here in the book of Mark, starting from verse 12. And the description goes on. This is what happened, and this is now where we are. We are now on this very day when a lamb was to be sacrificed for the celebrations of the Passover. It's on this very night that Jesus institutes a new covenant, and he considers his body and his blood as what is sacrificed for the sake of the salvation of people, right? So in this episode, I've just considered why Passover happened, when it happened, and what significance it had on this very night. And again, what a coincidence that Jesus instituted a new covenant on this very same night when a lamb was to be slaughtered and sacrificed for the celebrations of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Thank you for joining me in this episode, and I hope that we keep learning through these reflections on Easter, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.